It's a quest for the ultimate treasure, where history is waiting to be made and destinies hang in the balance. The adventure of a lifetime. Sounds pretty good, right? Everyone thinks they have what it takes, until the arrows start flying and the walls begin to close in. Some people spend their whole lives on this quest, but only a few ever find the treasure. The blink of an eye is all that separates destiny from defeat. The difference between making history or being history.
Hang on!
Wherever the adventure takes you, no matter how dangerous the destination or impossible the victory, fate has propelled you to this moment. It won't be easy, but remember what's at stake. Fortune and glory, kid. Fortune and glory.
So, Indiana Jones. Yeah, it seems like the right time to cover the escapades of the famous Dr. Henry Jones Jr. After spending so much time on the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, I think it'd be fun to cover another favorite adventure movie series of mine from my childhood. Now, I'll need to set some ground rules. The Indiana Jones franchise has been around for over 40 years, so the content within can get a little convoluted. While some of these stories may be fan favorites, for the sake of simplicity, I had to omit a ton of information. While Indy battling a Nazi cyborg named Mephisto or traveling to another dimension sounds cool, there's just too much to cover in a timely manner. So I'll cover those stories in the future. And to address the $300 million elephant in the room, yes, I know Dial of Destiny is coming up and could contradict or undermine any of this. This video could be very dated in just a few days, but I still think it's worth covering this franchise because of how goddamn fun it is. With all that out of the way, I invite everybody to sit back, relax, and enjoy this wild ride. Identifying a point in history to start with this is somewhat impossible. Do I go off the 6,000 year age for Earth according to the Christian Bible, or do I go off the Hindu belief of the Earth being 4.3 billion years old? In this universe, it appears that all religions are equally true, and as such, there is inherent conflicting information for creation stories. For the sake of simplicity, I'll be using the planetary age generally agreed upon by astronomers and geologists, around 4.5 billion years ago, with the human race only having been around for around 200,000 years. After all, Indiana Jones would probably agree with me on this one.
I'm a scientist.
For millennia, the human race developed much like in real life. Ancient peoples traveled all across the world, settling in all manner of unique locations. Between 70,000 and 100,000 years ago, early humans migrated into Asia and Europe. Currently, the search for when humankind arrived in the American continents remains ever-changing. New evidence comes to light frequently, but current estimates indicate that the early Native Americans arrived around 13,000 years ago. In 5000 BC, interdimensional beings arrived in the ancient city of Akator in Brazil, located in the western Amazon rainforest. Their civilization had existed for millennia prior, but upon the arrival of the 13 interdimensional beings, the Uga people of the region were taught irrigation, animal domestication, astronomy, and more advanced technology in general, which helped their civilization grow and prosper. The Uga worshipped these beings as gods, and carved the Nazca lines in the Peruvian desert as tribute. The Uga also had a custom of wrapping their heads to elongate their skulls in order to honor the gods as well. These creatures seem to have the goal of coming to Earth in order to learn about the life forms and the planet and their cultures, and seem to collect artifacts of cultural significance. They acted as a hive mind, one collective entity, and their ship was situated on the Temple of Akator, and over time their bodies seemed to perish, leaving behind only their crystal-like skeletons. In 1400 BC, after the Ten Commandments stone tablets were smashed by Moses, the pieces were placed in the Ark of the Covenant, which was a gold-covered wooden crate created on the instruction of God, a year after the Exodus from Egypt, and carried through the desert with the Hebrews on their voyage to the Promised Land. The Hebrews arrived in Canaan, and the Ark was then housed in the Temple of Solomon, where it remained for centuries. Legends told that the Ark possessed powers unlike anything mankind was capable of, and was a transmitter, a radio, for speaking to God. In 980 BC, the Egyptian pharaoh Shishak laid siege to the temple to steal the Ark, and brought it with him back to the ancient city of Tanis. After stealing the Ark, Shishak had visions of the Egyptian god of the dead, Osiris, warning him to hide the Ark from the eyes of the sun god, Amun-Ra. The Ark was placed in the Well of Souls, and the map room was created so only Ra could ever know of the location of the Ark. The Hebrew god discovered this transgression, and had Tanis buried in a sandstorm that lasted for a whole year, and both Tanis and the Ark of the Covenant were lost to history. Around 30 AD, Jesus Christ was set for execution by the Romans. Before his death, he had one last supper with his disciples. A cup, known as the Grail, was later used to catch Jesus Christ's blood during his crucifixion, after his body was pierced in the side by the spear of Longinus. Legends told that the Grail would heal all wounds, clear all diseases, and bring strength and vitality to the drinker. Joseph of Arimathea was entrusted as the caretaker of the Grail. In 37 AD, Joseph arrived in Great Britain with the Grail. However, the Grail became lost after Joseph's death. The Grail would see the light of day once again, as the great King Artorius, later known as King Arthur, found the Grail. The Grail was placed in the protection of Sir Benevere. Arthur was mortally wounded by Mordred, his nephew, and was taken to Glastonbury Tor by Benevere. After the passing of the great king, the Grail was returned to its place of its discovery. After the fall of Camlann, more commonly known as Camelot, to the Anglo-Saxon invasion in the 6th century AD, the Grail was discovered by Sir Galahad and brought to the monastery in Iona in Scotland. There, the Grail had remained for 300 years until Vikings sacked the monastery in the 9th century. The Grail passed through various civilizations over the coming centuries, even reaching central Ukraine in the city of Kiev. But over time, the Grail headed south. In 1080, a secret society had formed in Hatay, which is modern-day Turkey, which protected the Grail at all costs after having recovered the sacred artifact. The secret society became known as the Brotherhood of the Cruciform Sword, and they constructed a temple in Hatay to safeguard the Grail. The Grail was found once again by a company of knights from France during the First Crusade, and the three brothers had pledged to protect the Grail. The Great Seal had been created to prevent the Grail from leaving the temple, and for 150 years, many false Grails were found and kept along the real Grail, with the promise of death to whoever drank from them, as only those with a true heart and faith would be able to identify the real Cup of Christ.
You have chosen wisely.
The most worthy of the brothers stayed to safeguard the Grail, while the other two returned to Europe. The two brothers would leave behind clues to the location of the Grail, while the brother who was left behind would age one day for every time he was tempted to drink from the Grail. One of the brothers had a marker on his shield for the location of the Grail, but he was buried with said shield upon his death in Venice, Italy. The final brother returned to France, where he told his story to a friar. The friar recorded the location as being in a canyon deep in a range of mountains, and a painting was made that was kept in Austria-Hungary. Constantinople fell to the Turkish Ottoman Empire in 1453, and thus Christian merchants would be denied entry to the Silk Road, which was an ancient pathway from Asia to Europe that merchants would take great advantage of. At the time, Portugal was the dominant power on the seas, while its neighboring state Spain had been slower to the punch of exploring the world's oceans since they had spent years waging land-based wars. The newly empowered Spanish monarchs decided to fund Christopher Columbus's voyage out west in hopes of finding a new trade route to Asia. In late 1492, after nearly a month at sea, Columbus and his crew made landfall on an island known today as the Bahamas. Over the coming centuries, Europeans would aggressively expand westward into the Caribbean and the Americas. One of the earliest efforts to expand into the continent was by conquistador Hernán Cortés, who, according to legend, gave his jewel-encrusted golden crucifix to a fellow conquistador, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, in 1520. Sometime in the 16th century, conquistador Francisco de Orellana staged an invasion of the Amazonian city of Akator, under the belief it was the fabled city of gold, El Dorado, where he ventured into the temple and into the main chamber, where he stole the skull of one of the long-since deceased interdimensional beings that laid in rest there. He would be known as the Gilded Man after having stolen the skull. Orellana would keep hearing voices in his head the further he got away from Akator, and after his companions tried to steal the skull from him, Orellana ended up murdering them all. He was greatly remorseful for murdering the men, so he attempted to return the skull after asking his god for forgiveness. Orellana was ambushed by the guardians of the clifftop cemetery overlooking the Nazca lines in Peru, thinking these warriors were demons coming for him for his failure to obey the commands of the skull and his murders. He let out one final scream into the night, and the last thing Orellana would ever hear was the word, return. Orellana's body, and the bodies of everyone else he murdered, were mummified by the warriors and placed in a chamber deep underground with the skull, where they remained undisturbed for nearly 400 years. In pre-unified Italy, a mysterious group of adventurers and innovators gathered in Porto Paradiso in 1538. This group would carry on the greatness of the Renaissance by following four core values: romance, discovery, adventure, and innovation. The group made their headquarters in a large fortress at the base of a volcano, known as Mount Prometheus, and the fortress being named Fortress Explorations. The group would adopt the name the Society of Explorers and Adventurers. In 1700, the golden age of piracy began. This is almost right as the Renaissance ends. The era is defined by pirates being known as the true dominant force of the seas, so much so that the governments of the world would now fear these now legendary figures. In 1776, after decades of cultural divide from Britain and economic turmoil, the 13 overseas British colonies in America would rebel and fight a war for independence. The United States would go on to be one of the leading global superpowers in the future. In the 19th century, the United States would come to purchase and invade multiple territories belonging to France, Spain, Britain, Mexico, Hawaii, and Russia. On December 12, 1872, Henry Walton Jones was born in Scotland. Henry had attended Oxford University under the tutelage of Helen Margaret Seymour, where he had become an expert in Grail lore and medieval literature. Henry graduated university in 1893, and in 1898, he married an American woman named Anna, and the two would conceive a child. On July 1st, 1899, Henry Walton Jones Jr. was born. He would become famous as the globe-trotting adventurer and professor under the moniker Indiana Jones. All through young Indy's youth, he wanted to get out from under his father's shadow. Henry and Indy never got along well, and Anna was the glue that held the family together, especially between 1808 and 1910, where the Jones family toured the world for Henry's literature circuit. The family had traveled all over the world, such as Egypt, Morocco, Vienna, and France. Through visiting so many places at such a young age, Indy developed a love for learning, and met many people who would help build him into the archaeologist we all know. Some of his acquaintances from these early years include Pablo Picasso, Thomas Edward Lawrence, later known as Lawrence of Arabia, Teddy Roosevelt, who actually taught Indy how to shoot a gun, and Princess Sophie, the daughter of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. In May of 1912, Anna Jones died of scarlet fever, which drove a wedge further into the already troubled relationship between Indy and Henry, which impacted them both for decades. Later in the year, Henry Sr. began teaching at Four Corners University in Moab, Utah. While in Utah, Indy joined the Boy Scouts, and while on an expedition, he chose to explore some nearby caves with his friend, Herman. The two discovered a band of thieves led by a man with the moniker Fedora, who looted the caves and found the Cross of Coronado. Indy stole the cross for himself, as Herman was sent to fetch the sheriff. The thieves pursued Indy, who attempted to escape via circus train, where he'd become traumatized by snakes and would get his chin scar by trying to use a whip against a lion. He escaped and ran home, only to find his father completely disinterested in what he had to say. Fedora arrived at the Jones residence, and the sheriff revealed that the thieves had the right to ownership of the cross. Fedora gave the cross to a man in a Panama hat, and because he was impressed by young Indiana Jones's bravery, he gave him his fedora hat. Henry would continue his literature circuit, bringing Indy with him. Over the years, young Indiana Jones found himself in plenty of geographical conflicts, such as when he was caught up in the Mexican Revolution after being kidnapped by Pancho Villa. While there, he befriended Remy Baudouin, and the two decided to join the war effort in Europe. This marked the beginning of Indy's military career, as he was caught up in World War I. Indy adopted the name of Henry Defense and experiences the horror of the Battle of Somme. Indy traveled to Africa and searched for the fabled diamond called the Eye of the Peacock. He failed, but soon after moved back to the United States to become an archaeologist in 1919. He enrolled in the University of Chicago, where he met his longtime rival, Renee. In 1923, after a failed coup attempt on the German Wehrmacht government, Adolf Hitler was arrested and sent to prison for 9 months on charges of high treason. In that time, he wrote a book titled Mein Kampf, which spread in popularity all across Germany. His book promoted all of his horrible ideologies, ranging from anti-Semitism to Aryan racial supremacy. Indy met Harold Oxley and became a prodigy of Abner Ravenwood in 1925. Ravenwood was obsessed with the legends of the Lost Ark, and Indy became a surrogate son for Abner. In 1926, eventual right-hand man of Indiana Jones, Wan Li, was born in Shanghai, China. Eventually, he would go by the name Short Round, or Shorty. In 1927, Indy and Abner's friendship came to a close, as Indy made moves on Abner's daughter, Marion Ravenwood, between 1925 and 1926. This drove both Oxley and Ravenwood to detest Jones. In 1930, Indiana Jones became a professor of archaeology at Marshall College in Bedford, Connecticut. Also in 1930, the Great Depression finally reached Germany, causing Mein Kampf, a book that promoted the idea of using Jewish people as scapegoats for all the issues the German people faced, to become a form of sacred text. Every German household owned a copy. In 1931, Jones went on a search for the legendary Fountain of Youth in Peru, but unbeknownst to him, this is not the location of the fountain. He had entered the temple and found the crystal skull inside, though not the same kinds of skulls as found in Akator. As it turned out, the temple was not meant to be disturbed, so Indy barely escaped with his life as the traps set in the temple were triggered. In later years, he would keep searching for the legendary location over the course of his career. In 1932, Indy met yet another enemy, Professor Garrett Reed, an archaeologist attempting to loot a golden idol to sell on the black market in order to fund his lavish lifestyle. Karma came back to bite Reed, as he was murdered the same year for trying to steal the Emerald Trinity in order to secure immortality, as the jungle vines protecting it had strangled him to death. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became the Führer of Germany. He spent years sowing fear of a communist takeover and fears of the Jewish people having secret agendas. The regime underwent rapid industrialization, resulting in Germany quickly becoming a global superpower, one that intended on enforcing its monstrous will on the rest of the world. In 1935, Indiana Jones had acquired the urn of Nirachi, containing the ashes of the first emperor of the Manchu dynasty in China, which Jones had used to barter with the Chinese mobster Lao She in exchange for the diamond of the Peacock's Eye in Club Obi-Wan in Shanghai. The exchange eventually snowballed into a huge skirmish, with Indy narrowly escaping with his life and the lead singer of the club being caught up in the heat of conflict, resulting in her joining Jones as she escaped out of Shanghai with Short Round. Unbeknownst to Jones, the plane they escaped on was owned by Lao She, and the pilots took the only parachutes aboard and jumped off the plane while it was on a course to collide with the mountain. Indy gathered Shorty and Willie at the door and jumped out while inflating an emergency raft, which broke their fall. They were sent speeding down the mountain and into the rapids before finding themselves in a desolate village in India. Indy was tasked with finding the Shankara stones, along with all the kidnapped village children, and ventured into a large palace where they were believed to be hidden. They ventured into the underground chambers of the palace, finding a massive temple underneath, and what's worse, the temple seemed to be a home of the thought-to-be extinct Thuggee cult. Jones was captured and brainwashed by the cult and was tasked with sacrificing Willie, and Shorty was used as a slave in the mines, which he quickly escaped from. Shorty freed Indy of his mind control by burning him with a torch, and he and Indy battled the Thuggee warriors and saved Willie. They had battled the rest of the warriors in the temple, freed the children, and escaped on minecarts, only to end up on a cliff face. They would successfully get to the top, but were surrounded by the Thuggee on a rope bridge. Indy showed Willie and Shorty that they had to hold on as he took a machete and cut the bridge down. Indy battled Mala Ram for the stones, where two of them fell into the river below, as with Mala Ram himself. Indy, Willie, and Shorty made it back to the top safely, and they were saved by the English army. The Thuggee had created a voodoo doll of Indy in order to keep him under their control, but once Indy was freed of their control, he took the doll and gave it to his longtime friend, Trader Sam, in order for Sam to destroy it safely. However, he ended up keeping it. Later that year, after his adventures in India, Jones set up a new expedition in the region, in an oasis, which was home to a stone temple of the Hindu tiger god Shirdil. Jones searched the temple for a piece of the golden rod of Shirdil, along with the map to the temple of the Forbidden Eye. Jones was trapped in the temple, but freed by Dr. Rachel Flannery, only to learn that she wanted to help save him to grave rob the temple. She attempted to kill Jones, but after fighting Indiana, she was knocked into the stone tiger's mouth, killing her. After acquiring the map to the Temple of the Forbidden Eye, Indiana Jones and Sala discovered the temple in the Lost Delta of India in July of 1935. An expedition and examination within the temple was conducted by the Jungle Navigation Company and the British Colonial Affairs, who requested Sala and Jones conduct tours inside the temple for tourists, to which Jones begrudgingly agreed. 1 year later, in July of 1936, Indiana would become lost in the ruins of the Temple of the Forbidden Eye, and during his absence, Sala continued his tours of the temple to raise more money. One group of tourists experienced the tour, but didn't heed the warning to avoid looking into the cursed eyes of Mara, and in retaliation, Mara and the spirits of the temple attempted to kill the tourists. The tourists crossed paths with Indiana, who helped them survive the encounter, but he also followed the tourists back to the outside world. Later that year, Indiana Jones searched the Peruvian jungles in search of the temple housing a golden fertility idol. Jones narrowly escaped the temple with his life, only to have the idol taken from him by the rival archaeologist, Renee, who partnered with the indigenous Jovitos tribe. The Jovitos warriors chased Indiana Jones back to his plane, and upon boarding the plane, Jack Lindsay piloted the two back to the United States. After completing a lecture with the students, Jones was summoned by Marcus Brody to a meeting with two federal agents. The agents explained to Jones that they intercepted a transmission from the Nazis who were excavating the deserts of Egypt. Indiana pieced together that they were on the search for the Lost Ark of the Covenant, which could be used as a superweapon to crush all of Hitler's enemies. Soon after, Jones boarded a flight to Nepal in order to find the headpiece of the Staff of Ra to unlock the Ark's location in the Well of Souls from his old mentor, Abner Ravenwood. Upon arriving, Jones reunited with Marion Ravenwood and learned that Abner had passed away. Indy was asked to leave, but Nazi agents arrived and threatened Marion for the headpiece, but thankfully, Indy returned in time to fend them off. Marion joined Indiana Jones on his trip to Cairo, Egypt, where they met with S.E.A. Indy and Marion walked through the streets before being ambushed by swordsmen. Marion hid inside of a basket, found by Nazi agents, and she was placed in the back of a truck. Indy fired his gun at a similar-looking truck, which was loaded with explosives, and it exploded. Jones blamed himself for Marion's apparent death, so he drunkenly confronted Belloc at a bar, but he was saved from gunmen by the local children. Indy and S.E.A. met with the local scholar Imam, who translated the inscriptions on the headpiece. Given that the Gestapo agent Tot grabbed the headpiece while it was burning hot back in Nepal, he only had one half of the inscripted text of the headpiece burned into his flesh, but the half that was on his hand did not include the instruction to take back one Kadam to honor the Hebrew god, whose ark this is, causing the Nazis to miss the proper location of the Well of Souls. Indy and S.E.A. snuck into the dig site in the Egyptian desert, noticing the Nazis were digging in the wrong place. Indy entered the map room and used the headpiece of the Staff of Ra to locate the proper location of the Well of Souls, and soon after, he stumbled into Marion in one of the tents. He elected to leave Marion so no suspicion would be raised as to her absence. During the evening, Indy and S.E.A.'s crew of diggers excavated the entryway into the Well of Souls, where he and S.E.A. dropped down to recover the Ark. Indy and S.E.A. managed to bring it back to the surface, but the crew was soon found by Belloc and the Nazis. Marion was thrown into the well, and the door was sealed shut, but the two managed to escape the well unscathed. Once outside, Indy and Marion saw the Nazis were going to load the Ark into an aircraft headed for Berlin, and they attempted to steal it. They were spotted by mechanics. Indy battled a German thug, and the plane blew up during the battle. The Nazis then loaded one of their trucks with the Ark, where the Indy gave chase. Successfully recovering the Ark, Jones and Marion were sent aboard the Bantu Wind, captained by a friend of S.E.A., Captain Katanga. The Nazis located the ship, kidnapped Marion again, and took the Ark aboard their submarine, which Indy snuck aboard and remained hidden on the surface portion during their voyage to the secret Nazi-controlled island base, Geheimhaven. Indy stole a uniform and followed the Ark convoy to their altar for the Ark ritual, and threatened to destroy the Ark with a bazooka if they didn't free Marion. Belloc called his bluff, and Jones was captured. Jones and Marion were tied to a pole near the altar, and the Ark ritual began. The camera equipment and electronics in the area were all destroyed, spirits rose from the Ark, and, after Indy told Marion to close her eyes and not look at anything, the spirits proceeded to slaughter the Nazis, leaving no trace of them in their wake. Jones and Marion opened their eyes and saw their bonds were torn. They returned to the United States, where the Army intelligence officials promised the Ark would be studied by top men. Unbeknownst to Jones, the Ark was placed in storage at Hangar 51, presumably never being researched. After the meeting, Marion offered to buy Jones a drink, and the relationship would grow stronger for a brief period through 1937, leading up to the two unknowingly conceiving a child, and they planned on getting married, only for Indy to leave Marion at the altar. Marion kept her son's heritage a secret. In 1938, Henry Mutt Williams was born, and he was told through his childhood that his father was the late aviator Colin Williams, and he was raised by Marion and Harold Oxley. Later in 1938, Indy traveled with Jock Lindsay to Florida, in search of the long-forgotten fountain of youth. Jock landed his plane at a small lake in central Florida, which somewhat annoyed Indy. Also in 1938, Jones received word of the location of the Cross of Coronado, and he had also heard the owner of the cross was the man wearing the Panama hat, which Indy remembered from his childhood. The man telling this to Indy claimed he wanted revenge on the Panama Hat Man, so Indy flew to Panama and found out the cross was being held on a cargo ship headed for the United States. Indy found the cross, but learned this was all a setup, where he then reunited with the Panama Hat Man. Indy managed to outsmart the thugs aboard the ship. He took the cross and jumped off the ship into the stormy ocean right before the ship exploded. Indiana brought the cross back to Marcus Brody, and it was sold to a museum. Not long after this, Henry Sr. went missing on an expedition to find the Holy Grail of Arthurian myth. Using his father's journal and intel from Walter Donovan, Indy traveled to Europe with Brody and met with the Austrian archaeologist Dr. Elsa Schneider and snuck into the Nazi-controlled castle to rescue his father. As it turned out, this was a setup for the Nazis to steal the journal from the Joneses. The Joneses managed to escape the castle on a motorcycle, but Henry Sr. managed to convince Indiana to sneak into Berlin to recover the Grail journal from the Nazis, where they were staging a book burning. Jones took the journal from Elsa, but bumped into Adolf Hitler, who autographed it. Indy and Henry boarded a Zeppelin to Athens, but halfway through the flight, the Zeppelin started turning back to Germany, so Indy and Henry escaped aboard the small airplane docked to the Zeppelin. After an aerial dogfight, the two managed to escape to the ground, where they outwit the final plane that was attacking them. The two met with Sala in Iskenderun, and they traveled to the Republic of Hetay to save Brody, who was captured by the Nazis, and Henry Sr. became captured by the Nazis as well. Indy managed to free Brody and Henry, and the tank fell off the cliff, and Indy narrowly escaped falling to his death. They managed to find the temple housing the Grail, but the Nazis arrived beforehand, and they were quickly captured. Henry was shot by Donovan, so Indy journeyed into the temple and survived each trap to recover the Grail, in the hopes of saving his father's life with the Grail's healing powers. Indy met with the last surviving Grail Knight, but Donovan and Elsa followed behind him, and they were tasked with choosing which of the dozens of cups on display was the real Cup of Christ. If they made the wrong choice, it would kill whoever drank from the cup. Elsa chose a cup covered in gold and jewels, and this caused Donovan to be killed after drinking from it. Indy chose the real Grail, the Cup of a Carpenter, and it managed to save his father's life. The Grail could not leave the temple, however, so when Elsa had tried to cross the seal with the Grail, the temple began to collapse, spelling her demise. Indy attempted to take the Grail for himself, but Henry convinced him to let it go. Indy, Henry, Brody, and Sala all managed to escape alive, and they rode off into the sunset on horseback. Indy and Henry found something more important than the Grail that day. They found each other again. In 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland, causing France and the United Kingdom to declare war on Germany, sparking World War II. During the war, Jones turned to work in espionage for American intelligence. Jones met with George McHale, an agent for MI6, and the two were sent on a number of missions through both Europe and the Pacific fronts of the war, where one mission had them go undercover as double agents in Berlin. He was sent on missions all over the world, such as Haiti, Flensburg, Mount Sinai, and Italy. In June of 1944, McHale and Jones were both involved in the D-Day invasion. That same year, Jones and Basil Shaw infiltrated a Nazi castle, boarded a train where Jones found a supposed dial that could change the course of history. They encountered two Nazis, and Jones lost possession of the dial soon after. With the detonation of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs a few months after the suicide of Adolf Hitler and the subsequent surrender of Nazi Germany, World War II came to a close. Indiana Jones left the war effort holding the rank of colonel, and was regarded as a war hero. In June of 1947, an aircraft of unknown origin crash-landed in the desert outside of the sleepy town of Roswell, New Mexico. A local rancher named W.W. Mac Brezel found the debris of the craft, but pushed much of it aside believing it was just some junk. Being in such a remote area with no phones or radios, Brezel was unaware of the UFO craze at the time. On Saturday night of July 5th, Brezel drove to Corona, where he heard about mysterious flying discs, so upon his arrival back to the crash site 2 days later, he took some of the debris to the sheriff's office. On Tuesday, July 8th, the RAAF recovered all the debris from the crash, along with the body of an unknown humanoid entity. Soon after, the United States government hired many civilian specialists to examine the body, without being told any context as to its origins. One of these specialists was Indiana Jones, and after the examination was complete, Jones was sworn to secrecy. In 1948, Jacques chose to retire to a lake in central Florida that he fell in love with all those years ago, where he had a large aircraft hangar constructed. In winter of 1950, Indiana Jones and his friend Grey Cloud were on the run from bandits, who were after Grey Cloud for his sacred peace pipe. The two hid inside an abandoned shack in the woods, where Indy found an old saxophone. He told Grey Cloud of his history with blues music, but the thugs entered the shack and held Grey Cloud and Jones at gunpoint. Once they took off with the pipe, Jones played a high note on the saxophone, causing the snow on the roof to fall on the thugs. Grey Cloud and Jones recovered the pipe and escaped. In 1951, Henry Jones Sr. passed away, and the following year in 1952, Marcus Brody also passed away. The two having died so soon took a toll in Indiana, which stuck with him for years to come. In 1955, Jock Lindsay fully retired from flying, and he turned his hangar into a bar where many influential figures of the time frequented, and he became a member of the Society of Explorers and Adventurers. In 1957, while searching through ancient ruins in the Yucatan Peninsula, Jones and Mack were captured by agents of the Soviet Union. They took the two men back to Nevada in the United States, to a secret military base, Hangar 51. They were confronted by the leader of these troops, Irena Spalko, Stalin's personal favorite military scientist. Her goal was to obtain the corpse of the humanoid entity from the Roswell crash from 10 years prior, but Mac betrayed Jones to aid the Soviets. Jones escaped, battled more Soviet soldiers, and wandered the desert until he found a seemingly normal American town in the desert, only to learn that it was a nuclear test site. He survived the nuclear blast, but was captured and interrogated by the FBI, and returned to his teaching duties at Marshall College. The FBI searched his office, scared the staff at Marshall, and convinced the dean to put Indy on indefinite leave with pay. As Indy was leaving Connecticut, he was stopped by Mutt Williams, who asked for Indy's help in finding his mother, who he explained was somebody who knew Indy years ago, who had disappeared trying to find his surrogate father, Harold Oxley. Ox had gone missing searching for the crystal skull of Akator. So Mutt and Indy journeyed to Nazca, Peru, in order to save Oxley and Mutt's mother. The two found Orellana's tomb, along with the crystal skull, but were captured by the Soviets accompanied by Mac. Spalko tried using the telepathic powers of the skull on Jones, and if he did not reveal all information on the skull to her, she would have Mutt and his mother Marion Ravenwood gunned down. Oxley was also present, incoherently mumbling after having gone mad from the power of the skull, and Indy deciphered the clues to find El Dorado. Mutt set the tent on fire, and escaped with Indy, Oxley, and Marion into the jungle, where Indy and Marion got stuck in some quicksand, and the Soviets captured them once again. The next day, Indy, Marion, and Mutt were all in the back of a truck being driven through the jungle, but Indy and Mutt managed to work together to break free. Indy took control of the truck, and a chase broke out to steal the skull. Mac revealed himself to be a double agent, and the gang managed to get their hands on the skull and journeyed to the hidden temple leading to Akator. They climbed the pyramid and journeyed inside it, and it turned out that Spalko was hot in their tail. Spalko cornered the gang in the temple, and reconnected the skull with the decapitated crystal skeleton, one of the 13, which all fused into one entity, causing the temple to start collapsing. The alien creature sensed the evil intentions of Spalko, and transferred so much information into her brain that it caused her to spontaneously combust. A portal opened under the flying saucer that the temple housed, and the Soviets were sucked into the portal, along with Mac, even though Indiana Jones tried to save him. Indy understood the aliens as fellow beings driven by a desire for knowledge, and embraced his new family with Marion and Mutt. Upon returning to the United States, Indiana Jones and Marion Ravenwood got married. He filled the role of being Mutt's new father, and was given the position of the Dean of Marshall College. Starting in 1955, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a rivalry to outmatch each other in the realm of space exploration. As part of the aftermath of World War II, Operation Paperclip was in effect, an initiative to employ former Nazi scientists to aid in the creation of weaponry, which eventually extended to the space race. In 1969, Indiana Jones and his goddaughter Helena Shaw met, and they are pursued by the former Nazi scientist Jürgen Voller, who wanted to find the Dial of Destiny to correct Hitler's greatest mistakes. And this is where the current story of Indiana Jones ends, at least for now. This video should be released before the new film, Dial of Destiny, releases, and as it stands, I have no idea how this movie is going to end, or if it'll retcon the original intro or outro segments of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles series, with elderly Indiana telling his life story. But all I do know is that this will be the final adventure for Indiana Jones, the last in a long line of journeys around the world, saving countless people and defeating foe after foe, saving the world from the shadows, chasing after fortune and glory, and finding something far more valuable, be it love, honor, appreciation, or family. I don't know what the future holds for Dr. Jones, but we can all learn a thing or two from his incredible stories. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please do me a solid, and like and subscribe. Comment down below your thoughts on any part of this timeline. Which adventure of Indy's was the craziest? Which artifacts do you think are the coolest? Let's get a discussion going, since I always love talking about Indiana Jones. If you want to chat one-on-one with me, I have a Discord server. All are welcome to join. I also have a Patreon page and a merch store if you want to financially support this channel, so I can keep making videos like this. These take a long time to make, so it means the world if you checked out those pages. Also, share this video with your friends. That's all for today, and thank you so much for watching.